yeah, I think coaching is one of those jobs that it's, find a job that you love and you'll never work a day for the rest of your life. And that's, a wonderful situation to be in as a coach. It's also, a completely double-edged sword.
The Triathlon Show 227. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of That Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. I'm your host, Michael, and on today's episode, we have part 2 of the interview that I did with David Tilbury-Davis. And in this part, we do deviate a bit from what 95% of this podcast is about, which is helping athletes train, race, and perform better in endurance sports. That was definitely the core of last week's interview. So if you missed it, please go back and listen to it. It was a fantastic discussion. This episode is not quite like that. It's more directed or specifically directed to coaches out there. Of course, athletes that might be interested in learning more about some of the behind the scenes of coaching should definitely tune in and listen. David has 25 years of coaching experience, so I can think of nobody better than to discuss these topics than him. So we're really excited to bring this episode, especially for all of you coaches listening. If you missed last episode, I just want to note for context that David is coaching myself. So that's why we know each other. If it seems like we know each other better than we should, then that would be the reason. And in addition, I would say that I would definitely consider David a mentor for myself as a coach, which made this particular discussion really, really interesting. Hope you find it really valuable as well. We'll get right into it after thanking our sponsors. First, we have Precision Hydration that you can find on precisionhydration.com. Electrolytes is not by any means the exclusive reason for cramping, but it is one of several factors that probably has a significant influence on whether cramps occur or not. And I've noticed this in myself anecdotally in swimming in particular, and that if I go and do a swim in the afternoon after having done a long or hard run in the morning, that I tend to get cramps unless I am really, really diligent about rehydrating with electrolytes. Actually hydrating with electrolytes during the run if possible, which sometimes it is because I tend to have a long treadmill run on Friday mornings, which is the particular context where my swim cramps tend to occur as well. But also rehydrating with a bit of more electrolyte drink in between that run and the swim workout later in the afternoon is something that I found definitely helps me stave off those cramps. And when I do experience cramps, it's probably because I have not. I see a clear correlation when I fail to rehydrate properly the way I normally do. That's when those cramps occur. So if you're somebody who is prone to cramps, then electrolytes is an avenue that you should explore. You can find Precision Hydration's product on precisionhydration.com and get 15% off your order with the promo code ThatTriathlonShow15. And thank you to Roka that you can find on Roka.com. Roka manufactures wetsuits, tri-suits, swimskins, goggles, high-performance eyewear, and prescription glasses. And as I mentioned on last week's episode as well, if you are trying to compensate the probably closed pools in many areas of the world at least with some more open water swimming, then having a good wetsuit is absolutely a prerequisite for that. And in some situations, if you are going to try to do it in fairly chilly water temperatures, then perhaps it might be possible, but in a thermal wetsuit rather than a normal standard wetsuit. And Roka do offer thermal wetsuits. So if that's something that you're considering, then check that out. You can get 20% off your entire order, not just wetsuits, anything Roka sells on roka.com/TTS. That is where you will get that 20% discount code. Now, without any further ado, let's hear David Tilbury-Davis' perspectives on coaching. So welcome back, David, to part 2 of our discussion. And we will discuss some topics related to coaching in this part. And these are some topics that you kindly outlined that you think are important. So we'll just get right into it with first defining success as a coach. What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think as a coach, we have a very obvious responsibility to maximize performance at races. But I've always felt that that's sort of describing what it says on the tin. Like I said in the previous podcast, if you go to a bank and you ask for some money, then you expect the bank to have some money, not to have some carrots and an aubergine for sale. So, so as a coach, when people say, my success is defined by the performances that my athletes have, then that's great. The more successes you've had, that's wonderful. But the reality is, how much of a positive impact have you had on those individuals as people? How much has there been injury and athletes moving on. Those to me are sort of better definitions of success. If you've been working for many athletes over the years, and the average time that you spend working with athletes is counted in years rather than sort of weeks, then that's probably a reflection of the fact that you're making a fairly significant and meaningful difference to that individual. Likewise, if when people move on, that it's fairly apparent that the relationship has been more than just prescription of training sessions, and they tell you that you've influenced their perspective on life in a certain way. Or I had a situation recently where an athlete said that how their fitness and performance had improved had impacted on their sort of well-being, and as a consequence their performance in the workplace. That to me is a much better definition of success.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And one thing that I've always remembered for a couple of years, I think, since Steve Magnus mentioned it on his podcast with Jonathan Marcus, is that one thing that for him was a real benchmark. Obviously, the context is different, working face to face with collegiate athletes and some post-collegiates, but in this context, I think it was collegiate athletes mostly, and even high school athletes. Anyway, when you're invited to one of your athletes' wedding, that's sort of when you know that you made a really, really meaningful impact in the athlete's life, and that's meant more than any race performances or wins or victories. And that always stood out to me as being a really good way to think about defining success.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd agree 100% with that. And I'd say that I've been invited to one wedding in the last few years, and had probably over a slightly longer period of time had two athletes end up married. So it's a good definition.
And next on our list, we have one more thing on that note, by the way. Also, a thing to take into consideration is that if we define success only by race performances, then obviously athletes do have different abilities to train, time to put into training, depending on the life context, and also just basic genetic talent also comes into play there. So I guess that can you speak to just, do you think about how close you can get the athlete to their potential with the context that they're in? And is that something that it's impossible to know, of course, but how do you think about that?
I think with time, with coaching, you get a sense of an athlete's potential when you get glimpses into how they approach certain workouts and where their potential and future may lie. But I think, absolutely. I think if an athlete crossed the finish line at their A race and said, I laid it all out there. There wasn't an ounce of me left that I could have put out on that race course. And they came away, not in the position that they wanted to be in terms of, outcome, or not with a time that on an outcome basis that they were expecting. Then I would be, I'd be really happy, but I'd also then start to say, okay, well, was there an issue with the process? Did we get it wrong in terms of, optimizing their ability, or actually did we get it right? And actually, on the day, everybody was slow, and that's a really common one, particularly with the swim is, triathletes, they come out of the water, they look up the clock and they look at the time and they go, well, that was a terrible swim. And then the rest of their day is ruined. But in the moment, you have absolutely no idea what that means in the context of everybody else's performance. And it might mean that actually, rather than being sort of, 97th percentile performance in your age group in that race, that actually you were 99th, but just everybody was slow. I think there's sometimes a little bit of context to be had. So I try to persuade athletes not to get too hung up on outcome, because in essence, process, should deliver outcome.
Yeah, and in the context of success in terms of outcomes and race performances, not necessarily results in terms of times, I do think that thing you mentioned with looking at percentiles of your age group or the overall men's or females field, that's a much better way to look at things than just pure times because of the conditions that may change, or if you're racing on different courses, that is an obvious one that completely makes comparisons not irrelevant but difficult. Yes. And so that's something that I do for all athletes, looking at the percentile in each discipline and overall, and see if we're improving in that regard, at least in races that have large enough fields that you can get significant. And
that's where, and that's absolutely, picking up on the point that you made there, that's absolutely where, certain training devices, actually allow us to understand, was that, like a personal best performance, rather than, racing on feel. Sometimes, having a power meter on the bike, or, wearing a GPS device on the run, you don't necessarily have to see the data, in terms of power output, if you want to race on feel. But being able to go back and say, okay, yeah, actually, that was a really well-paced, really well strategically executed race, that resulted in a PB performance, can only be a positive. Whereas, not necessarily taking advantage of any of those things and just coming away and going, that was the time when I crossed the line. It doesn't mean anything. There's all sorts of things that could have gone wrong or right within that discipline of the race.
Yeah. How do you, by the way, make sure that how you perhaps see success for an athlete is aligned with what they see as success for themselves?
I try to get a really good understanding when I'm working with an athlete of what drives them, what makes it meaningful to them. I think probably some years ago, I probably would have got quite hung up on the differences between, intrinsic motivations, so sort of internal ones, and extrinsic motivations. So, simplistically, something like, say, what peer recognition is. I tend not to now. I actually think that there's many aspects of people's characters that can have both a positive and a negative side to them. So, for instance, like, narcissism might be an aspect of a character that people might look at and say, well, that's a really bad thing. And yes, there are definitely negative traits to that quality, but there are also some positive traits to that quality. And so I really try to understand, the individual, and what their definition of success is. And actually, over the winter, I sort of went through a process of, reviewing the previous year with individuals and looking ahead and say, okay, outline to me, what your definition of success is. And one of them said, well, I have to get on the podium, because if I get on the podium, I get a puppy. And and ironically, there's actually a professional triathlete who recently, in the last 6 months, got a dog exactly because of that outcome. And so something as as amusing as that, to understand that as a coach, for me to understand the individual, to understand what they're sort of emotively connected to, is a very powerful, ability to strengthen our working relationship.
Yeah. The next point on our list is creating meaningful work as a coach. I'll let you take it.
I think coaching is it's a very unique job, whereby it's predicated on a transactional basis. People are paying you to deliver performance, but the flip side of that is it has a huge demand to have a relationship, sort of on an emotional level. I need to understand them, they need to understand me. I need to understand that how they see the world and how they interpret aspects of communication, because they might be 20 years 30 years younger than me, or they might be very similar age to me, or they might be from a different culture. So a simplistic example might be, I'm English, have a tendency to be a little bit sarcastic sometimes, and also swear at times, not in a losing my temper way, but and as a consequence, with some individuals, they may not fully grasp the humor in that, and I need to be respectful of that. So I have one athlete that I work with that never swears ever, in writing, verbally. But then I've also known athletes that would put a fisherman to shame in terms of their use of language. So as a tool of expression. So I need to. It's not, as a coach, it's not being disingenuous and being chameleon with your personality. It's actually mirroring an individual so that you can put yourself on their level, and that makes it a lot more meaningful when you can put yourself on their level, and actually you get a real sense that the athlete really values you as an individual, as a person, not on a monetary basis, but as a person. That makes it a lot more meaningful in my mind. And that can only come through developing that coach-athlete relationship.
Yeah, and one other thing that I guess comes into play here is the communication, just things like the frequency of communication, because that's something that obviously different coaches have very different models in how that works. And for some, coaching might be more of writing a program and the athlete goes out and gets on with it. But in other situations, like with you, for example, there's definitely an emphasis on being in communication and catching up on how things are going and that sort of thing. And I guess that's also something that you would say contributes to making the relationship meaningful rather than just being
it does.
the transaction of bringing the athlete a training plan.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think probably the most powerful question you can ask an athlete when you work with them remotely is, how are you? And some individuals, culturally will go straight into XYZ about training, and other cultures are very different. I used to work with an athlete from South America who it used to make me chuckle, because every time I'd phone him to talk about his training, it was he had, he was an age grouper, he had a day job, so it was, scheduling calls with time differences was, a little bit difficult sometimes. But then when we catch up, he'd always be like, yeah, what are you up to? How's your wife doing? How's things going? How are you feeling? What are you up to? And I'm like, wait. I'm meant to be the one talking to you about your training. But to him, the depth and value of our working relationship was predicated on him knowing me as a person and understanding me as a person. And I think as a coach, creating a sort of meaningful coaching relationship also means, at times making yourself vulnerable and actually allowing athletes into your life and saying, yeah, this is who I am as a person. This is, it is important to me, to, have a holiday or, spend time with my family at a weekend, rather than being 365, 24/7 available on call.
Yeah, that makes sense. One thing that got me thinking about is that me being a coach, but also being actively racing, I do notice that my athletes, they are always very interested to hear about how my training is going, how my racing is going, and that sort of thing. And sometimes the first half of a call may be about talking about how my race went that I just had last weekend. So
because they also want to know that you have bad days and bad moments and stupid decisions, or in the same way, as a coach, is that, do I have bad days, poor decisions, and, am I human? Because that creates connection.
Absolutely. And they also want to know what you are giving me for training. They're very interested in that, I'll tell you. So
there's nothing. Well, there's no secrets.
No, there isn't. Yeah. But it's always an interesting topic for discussion to see how different coaches go about things. We mentioned they're working remotely, and in the previous episode that we recorded, you mentioned that you do travel to clients to work face to face as well. How do you view those different ways of coaching, and even how do you compare the generally remote coaching with somebody who is always or almost always present, like having a squad of athletes that they work with?
Yeah, I mean, there's there's definitely some contentious coaches out there who say that if you're predominantly coaching remotely, then you're not a coach, and feel a need to kind of poo-poo that. I think that's that's inappropriate. I think ultimately the criticisms of coaching remotely are you may miss certain interactions or certain behavioral cues that you might see when somebody walks on deck in the morning. But I think, some of that can be overcome with getting the communication right and, making sure that there's, open and honest communication. And, and likewise, if you're working with somebody remotely, then that distance can create a level of objectivity and a lack of bias when you are being presented with data, when you are being, presented with subjective feedback. You might pick up on certain things, whereas if you're seeing somebody on a day-to-day basis, you might, create biases or actually miss certain things. Good example would be, if somebody that you see on a daily basis is always using a certain phrases in their language about how the training session was, over a period of time that very quickly becomes you become blasé about that. You don't really notice it. Whereas when individuals are giving subjective feedback, then as a coach I would say remotely you start to pick up on people using the same phrase or the same word regularly, and you start to think, maybe I need to take that on board. Simplistically, something like, wow, tired. I mean, that's a really basic one, but there's definitely things that you can spot when you work remotely, and there's things that you miss out on. And I think also when you work face to face, there's a lot that you pick up on, but there's a lot that you can also become biased about, or you can get very acute in your decision making because you lack the distance and objectivity.
How big of a benefit is it in terms of just the biomechanical development of an athlete, swim technique, run technique, and even just adjusting sessions on the fly to be able to be present with the athlete when they're doing their sessions? How much do you miss doing that from time to time when you can't do that as a remote coach?
I definitely miss it. And is it beneficial? Absolutely. That's I would not disagree with that in the slightest. Being able to see somebody swimming and give them feedback in real time is good. But then also you need to remember, when you are giving them feedback in real time, that you don't want to overload them every day with, think about this with your swim stroke, think about this with your swim stroke, think about this with your swim stroke. I think when I see video footage, when people send me video footage, and we pick out certain things, then I'm very cognizant of the fact that I only really want to give them one or two cues to go away and work on, because otherwise they're just constantly overloaded with sort of mental stimulus that they have to work through. And that's where going back to kind of just getting the basics right, keeping it simple, is pretty key.
Yeah, and we know from the professional world, of course, in triathlon, that you can become a world champion by being in a remote coaching relationship. So I think that poo-pooing that role is definitely, as you say, it's not something that there's no case for doing that. It just works.
There's no one right answer. I think it depends is the answer. Some athletes do very well with remote coaching. Other athletes do very well with face-to-face coaching. And in a perfect world, I would have a completely unfettered mix of that as and when I see fit. But the reality is, with many athletes in many different parts of the world, that's not always the case. And ironically, I've definitely had conversations with professional athletes who have a really good setup at home. They've got a good routine. They've got this particular pool down the road. They've got this particular running track nearby. They've got their setup at home. They've got their local supermarket they like to use. They're sleeping in their own bed. They're using their own pillow. And then when you say to them, we're going to do these training camps, and actually the response is a little negative, because they're creatures of habit and they like routine. And so when you take them out of that environment, there's a risk that actually you create more stress. The flip side of that is you could create a lot of positive stimulus by actually taking somebody out of a very chaotic environment and putting them into a sort of a very monastic existence.
Absolutely, yeah. I think it's fair to say that both being an athlete, whether it's professional or just an age group athlete that's trying to juggle a job, a family perhaps, but also being a coach with the way that coaching works, it's never really off. It never really stops. It's both are kind of extreme endeavors in kind of different ways. So yes. Mental health is something that is important to consider. What do you think about mental health for athletes and coaches?
I think it's a hugely important topic. Dean Karnazes wrote in one of his books. Dean Karnazes, for people who don't know, was quite a famous ultra runner. And one of his books, somebody in one of the chapters that was sort of involved with endurance athletes said, if we weren't doing ultra running, we'd probably all be alcoholics. There's definitely an addictive nature to people looking to be the best that they're capable of being, and there's also at the very pointy end, there's also a pretty significant level of anxiety, and that may be internalized to manage, because there's a persistent dissatisfaction at performance. And that's exactly why when athletes move on from their sport, it leaves a huge vacuum. Even if they've achieved the things that they wanted to achieve, the reality is that probably north of 90% of athletes, when they do step down from being a professional athlete or being a world-class age group athlete, when they do step down from that, they don't get to step down on their own terms, and that is a huge leaves a huge mental toll. And so for me as a coach, I think it's important to help the athlete manage the context of where sport sits in them, in terms of their identity, but also in terms of societally, identity, and help them understand that whilst this particular performance is incredible within the small community that we operate in the grand scheme of things, it's not that meaningful. And that's not to belittle their achievement. It's simply to say, okay, well, actually what you're better off doing is understanding the qualities that this is created in you and how that can, play out positively within a broader community.
Yeah, that's a really interesting perspective. I really like that. What are some issues that you see that athletes might have, whether it be a constant dissatisfaction with performance, perhaps not even in racing, but through the day-to-day grind of training, and many other things that you see? And how do you think that athletes should manage them, and how should coaches help manage those things that come up?
I think there's two aspects to that. I think the first is, being very, very honest and very clear with people about that failure is not a bad thing. That if you don't achieve, the goal that you set out to achieve, that's not a bad thing. That can actually help make you a better person. I also think that in the day and age that we live in, that there is sort of body dysmorphia issues that arise out of perception of what an athlete should look like, and based on what we see in the media, and managing that appropriately as a coach, I think is really important. I think I'm clearly male as a coach, and as dealing with female athletes, I'm not uncomfortable on the subject of weight or body image. I try to be as respectful of people's opinions about that, but I think it's a topic that we also need to be very open and honest about. That society has created these ideas of what athletes should look like, or what their lifestyle should be like. And I think being able to be comfortable having discussions around that is a healthy thing. And maybe if it gets into an area that is beyond my sort of duty of care, then that's where being able to introduce athletes to more specialist individuals, whether it's a sports psychologist or whether it's a nutritionist or a dietitian, is also where I should be ensuring I have the sort of communication skill set to position that appropriately.
And what about for the coaches, considering that it is such a almost constantly on occupation? How can we make sure that we prevent things like burnout? I think would be one of the most common mental illnesses that affect coaches. But probably
I think first and foremost is actually having your athletes understand, or as an athlete take the time to understand why your coach finds the job that they do meaningful, and be and also be respectful of the fact that they do have a life as well. I think, ensuring that my athletes understand that, I have, responsibilities as a member of a family or a parent, is important. I think having, mentors as a coach, and that doesn't have to be a mentor that's more knowledgeable or more experienced. It can be a peer, it can be somebody that's in a different sport, it can be somebody that is even within industry and just a leader within industry. And actually having somebody that you can turn to and have kind of candid conversations around, am I, when I think this and, I'm concerned about this, am I going crazy, or, actually, is that normal? Because the reality is that most people in a position of, leadership or influence, suffer the same, same things.
And what are some things that you've found helpful in creating a work-life balance, other than having that understanding from athletes? But have you found it difficult for yourself to actually just internalize yourself how to do that? Perhaps, well, you've been in this long enough that I imagine that you have some good ideas now how it works. But maybe early on it was a bigger problem. I know that certainly I still struggle with that quite a lot. So very interesting to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I think coaching is one of those jobs that it's, find a job that you love and you'll never work a day for the rest of your life. And that's, a wonderful situation to be in as a coach. It's also, a completely double-edged sword. And, you love, helping people be better people, better athletes. And there's a lot of vicarious satisfaction from that. And drawing the line is really, really important. There was a study done recently of a whole bunch of Olympic coaches within UK sport at an Olympic level, and probably one of the biggest things that stood out is that they were all terrible at work-life balance, and some of them had, it cost them relationships or marriages, and I think that's we need to be open and honest about that as coaches and say to athletes, this is a particular time of day that I'm not going to be able to have a conversation with you. And people might look at that and go, well, that seems fairly obvious, but unless you work unless you work as a coach, or you have experience as a coach, it's difficult to grasp that, we can create these situations where we feel a need to be, constantly connected or constantly responding to athletes, particularly when we work across different time zones. And that becomes like a second nature. And it's not healthy. You have to step back from that and turn around to athletes and say, yeah, actually, hang on a minute, but, understand this. And the reality is in most situations they go, oh yeah, no, that's fine.
So you just have to set some boundaries for yourself in terms of when you're turning off the phone and so on. Yeah,
absolutely. And also not get hung up on those boundaries, because, nobody died and no children were kidnapped. So it's kind of really not that big a deal.
Yeah, right. Then we have a point on data versus RPE. So what do you want to talk about there?
Yeah, I think we touched on that earlier around there's value in both. I think, again, when, as a community of coaches, there are people trying to sort of say, perception of effort is the most important thing. And other people are like, no, data is the most important thing. It's like, let's not get hung up on particular metrics, or, that everything has to be by feel. The reality is, as a coach, we need to be held accountable for, the quality of service that we deliver. And so we have to use ways of doing that, whether an athlete, feels a need for it or not. ultimately all of these training devices, GPS, power, all these things are, they're simply there to train the supercomputer that sits between the ears. You're not a slave to them. If you are, you're sort of coming at it the wrong way. They're educative tools. And sometimes they tell us things that, we don't want to hear. I've had situations with athletes where they said, yeah, I thought that race went really well, but I just don't get why my run, didn't go the way I wanted it to. And then, we look at the bike and we see that actually the pacing was really stochastic. And they go, well, it didn't feel like that. Well, I know it didn't feel like that, but the reality is it was. And so I think there's a place for both, because also, with perception of effort, you can also have athletes that, have a very particular predilection for, certain types of training. And so when they do certain types of training, the feedback is, biased towards the negative side, and they do other types of training and it's biased towards the positive side. And so, as a coach, it's important to contextualize that and say, is that a fair assessment or is it an unfair assessment?
Yeah, that's a great point. To kind of get to the biases that we all have, then the data can be really helpful in finding them in the first place and then addressing them.
One of the most useful things I keep to hand is actually a long list of different types of biases, and it's always useful to look back at it as a coach and say, oh yeah, actually, yeah, this. This is a trap that we can fall into, and this is a trap that we can fall into. It just helps keep things on track.
Yeah, it's great, and you sent it to me some time ago, and I really enjoy reviewing that every now and then as well. In terms of this is perhaps something that relates a bit more to what we discussed in the last episode with workout prescription, but also to how to make sure that the athlete sort of is not getting constantly dissatisfied and with their performance in training. Do you think about setting the athlete up for success in some way by the way that you design the sessions? Is that something that comes into play a lot, or how do you think about that? Basically, what I mean is perhaps by prescribing a range of intervals that they can choose in, depending on how they feel, or a large enough range of a target intensity that that they will at least be able to hit the lower end and they will be happy with that, or how do you think about that?
Yeah, I think I think within some of the workouts that I give, there's definitely it's implicit. There's certain workouts that I would give somebody where they have the opportunity to to grow, and other workouts where it's significantly outside their comfort zone. I think it's not carrot and stick, but there's definitely it's more nurturing somebody along in particular workouts. I've had an athlete I spoke to in the last few days said, wow, those workouts that we've done on Friday, the last couple of weeks, when I first looked at them, I thought, he must be out of his mind, thinking that I can hit that, and actually, they were able to do it. And it's not that I'm, some grand wizard. It's just sometimes you need to take people a little bit outside of their comfort zone and give them the opportunity to shine. And other times you do need to, create, almost like a workout where, they are going to fail. There is no not failing, because there's also a learning mechanism within that, or there's a physiological benefit to that. And as long as you position that with the athlete appropriately beforehand and say, look, we're going to do this particular workout, and I don't have an expectation of how many intervals you get done. It's up to you to do what you feel is the best that you're capable of doing on the day. Then that helps people understand that they just need to give it their best. and that may vary week to week.
Yeah, makes sense. And then we have the topic of doping. What are your thoughts on that? When do we have the next dose?
Yeah, I mean, it exists. I mean, there's not, I'm not going to sit here and make accusations. I think, when we look at humanity in and of itself, and, we look at research that's been done in education environments where there's a very high level of reward for success, then there's definitely evidence that probably 1 in 10 people will resort to behavioral patterns that would be constituted as cheating, and I don't think that's an unreasonable perspective to take within our sport. Now that depends on your definition of cheating. It may be drafting, that's a very simple one, or it might be blood doping, which is very definitely the other end of the spectrum. I think anti-doping establishments have a really, really hard job to do, because there are definitely things that athletes can do that are very easy to do, that are very unlikely to be picked up in the current anti-doping environment. And yes, of course, I would love to see significantly more anti-doping behaviors expressed by race organizations. But I also understand that costs a significant amount, and current situation aside, it's not a bottomless pit of money that they can throw at this. And I think that certainly within our sport there is also the issue of conflicts of interest within some events may not want to have the outcome of their race overshadowed by something that they find out later. But it's a pity, and I'd like to see that change. But I'm not in a position of power to make that change happen. But it would be nice to see that evolve, because there are always going to be individuals that will take a path of least resistance, rather than do the work, rather than work on sleep, nutrition, training approaches, recovery strategies. They'll take the easy route. That's evident in pretty much every sport that exists.
Yeah, and unfortunately, it's not just at the professional level; it also happens at age group level.
Yeah, absolutely, and there are definitely practices. We live in a day and age where there are also certain practices which fall into kind of like a grey area, and that's a really hard one. If somebody suffers from asthma and allergies significantly, to the point that as a professional athlete, you get an attack and you can barely walk at 10-minute mile pace. Then clearly that person needs to be doing something about it in order for them to do what they want to do. Is that cheating? Is that doping? I don't think it is. If somebody has a thyroid condition that requires medication, taking medication so that they can be a healthy individual, they cannot put themselves at risk. Is that doping? No. But I think when you step over a line and you get into the situation of people manipulating dosages in order to elicit certain responses physiologically, yes, that's clearly doping. Taking more of certain things or less of certain things to game the system is clearly an ethical behavioral pattern which would classify as doping in my book.
Yeah. So the final question before we wrap up here, and this one is not on our list, but I want to ask you to give 2 or 3 pieces of advice that coaches listening to this could benefit from.
Oof, wow. I think probably the first one would be, really try to understand your athletes as people and not as athletes. That's the first one. And I think the second one is also try not to be too hard on yourselves. That's the reality of coaching is that we exhibit the same behavioral patterns as top performing athletes. We have a persistent dissatisfaction with, are we doing things well enough? Are we paying attention to enough details? Have I paid attention to enough relevant factors? Did I miss something? Sometimes shit happens, as they say, and you need to kind of just roll with that. And so I think I would say, try not to be too hard on yourselves at times.
Yeah, that's good advice. So finally, where can people follow you, find out what you're up to, and any social media websites, etc., that you want to mention?
Yeah, I'm fairly easy to follow as Coach Tilbers on Instagram. And my website is www.tilburydavis.com. I tend to put up there sort of some of the sort of media bits of information, and that's about as exciting as it gets. I tend, I'm not a big one for social media, but working with Lionel at the moment. There's also, I've been in a few of the YouTube videos recently, so that was a whole new world for me. But anyway, that's some of the sort of insight into sort of what I do and who I work with that people can get.
Yeah, and we'll have that linked in the show notes. So thank you so much, David, for taking the time to do this long 2-part interview. And
my pleasure.
Pleasure talking to you, and I'll let you get back to your day and see that your athletes, your wife, and your little boy are all doing all right.
Thanks.
Hope that you enjoyed that episode. You can find the show notes on thattriathlonshow.com. If you missed last week's episode, David's perspectives on training, then definitely go and check that out on the website or in your podcast app. And also, as mentioned, if you're interested in finding out more about David, we'll have links to his website and his social media and that sort of stuff on the show notes and the podcast episode description. Next Monday, I interview Dr. Bradford Cooper on the topic of functional mental toughness. And in the last couple of months, we've had a lot of talk about training. I have found these discussions with really high-level coaches super fascinating, interesting, and I know that you have as well from the feedback I've been getting. And obviously, training is the bread and butter for any triathlon performers podcast, like that Triathlon Show. But that being said, it will be good to have a slightly different angle next week with the functional mental toughness topic that we have in store. Brad is very knowledgeable and a great speaker and teacher as well, I found when I interviewed him. So I'm sure that you will enjoy that episode a lot. So stay tuned, stay subscribed. This episode was one about coaching, and you may be a coach, but if you're an athlete and you're listening this far and you are looking for a coach, of course, I would highly recommend reaching out to David, but I do know that his waiting list is pretty long. So an additional great option, in my highly biased opinion, is the coaching here at Scientific Triathlon. We do have some slots available right away, so check out our coaching page on scientifictriathlon.com if you want to learn more, and send me an email to michael@scientifictriathlon.com, which is Michael with a K, if you're interested in setting up a conversation or learn more. Big thanks to our sponsors, Precision Hydration, that you can find on precisionhydration.com. You can get a personalized hydration strategy for your next race on the free hydration plan tab. And I will also give you an idea of a good estimate of what your sweat sodium concentration is, which can be very useful information, not just in racing, but also in day-to-day training. You can get 15% off your order with the promo code ThatTriathlonShow15. And thank you to Roka that you can find on roka.com/TTS. On that page, you'll get a 20% discount for your entire order, whether you're looking for wetsuits, tri-suits, swim skins, goggles, high-performance eyewear, or prescription glasses and sunglasses. It's valid, so take that opportunity. Thank you, as always, for listening. Keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.